You're listening to The CEOs, brought to you by the University of Alberta on the Corus Radio Network.
From his early days at Dome Petroleum to TransCanada Pipeline, BP Canada, finally arriving at Enbridge in 2005. John Carutthers brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to the position of president of Enbridge Northern Gateway. Over the next hour, I want to find out what drives him. What are his strengths? How he's dealt with adversity. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Carutthers as the first in a long list of great guests we're going to be introducing to you over the next 2 months in our CEO series. Hello, Mr. Carutthers.
Good afternoon, Angela.
You're an Alberta boy, growing up in Innisfail. Tell me some of your early memories about the importance of that small community, what it meant to you.
Well, I was born in Innisfail, but then we moved to Calgary when I was quite young. So the small community relative today would have been Calgary back almost 60 years ago. But certainly do remember, of course, a lot less restriction on what you did as a kid. You roamed the neighborhood, you knew all the fences to jump and the dogs who might chase you. But
for anyone listening in Calgary, what area did you grow up in? Because we've seen this city grow up incredibly.
I grew up in Thorncliffe, and at that point we're at the edge of the city. So all behind us was fields and hills and rocks that you could explore.
Were there any individuals in those early years that you really admired?
Probably the one that means the most to me that in the more formative years was one of my first rugby coaches, a butcher, in fact, and a person who somehow got you to work harder than you could ever conceive or want to, and do it with your buddies and still have fun and respect them. But again, I just look at that quality of how did he make us work so hard, and yet we really admired him.
You do have a large family, 6 kids. 2 of them have a very special story. Tell me about the twins you adopted from Haiti, I believe 11 years ago? Yes,
well, and talking about work, well, we'd had 4 kids, and again, I was at that part of my life traveling quite a bit with work, so we had 4, and so Teresa was kind of doing that largely on her own, and at that point we thought, well, that's a big enough family, so I had the zippity taken out of my doodah. So, and then a few years later, Teresa says we should have more kids. And I go, well, we've talked about this once, and then she said, well, why don't we adopt? So that's how I said, well, no reason we couldn't adopt. I mean, the only reason you'd have is you wouldn't be able to golf as much, because the other kids were starting to get to an age where they could do more things with you, but that didn't seem to be a very relevant fact in that discussion.
By the time they came to Canada, how old would they have been?
They were almost 2 years old at that time.
So the process took a little while to get them here.
Process took about a year, and in most cases it was a very legitimate process in terms of making sure you're fit parents and had the capability. A little bit frustrating near the end where it was delayed because they weren't the height and weight of a Canadian child for that age. And you're going, yeah, we get that. And so that was, because you're also at that time, you're very worried they could get really sick because they were so fragile. They weren't even 15 pounds and almost 2 years old. So just skin and bones. But so very, very exciting when they did get home.
Exciting. And of course, well, I mean, they're only 2 years old, so they don't really know too much. But at the same time, what a leap for them. You didn't bring them here in the winter or anything like that, did you?
We sure did. So how this went, Teresa and I flew down to Port-au-Prince. And on that plane, as it refueled, we met the twins in the airport with people who couldn't speak English, and we couldn't speak Creole. And so we just picked up the babies. They had a picture of us, and we picked them up and got back on the plane. So I think they spent the whole next 4 or 5 hours wide-eyed, these beautiful big brown eyes, looking at it, saying, "Who are you? Why are you white?" And then, of course, why'd you take us to this cold country? But
they are definitely a big part of your life.
Yes, very much.
They're president of Enbridge Northern Gateway, and of course we are talking about the pipeline. This has been a long road for Enbridge, hasn't it?
It certainly has. It went right back, and give a lot of credit to Pat Daniel, where I think he was the real inspiration for seeing the need to access an alternative market. The United States market had been very positive for Canada, but clearly saw the need to have an alternative source.
When did it really start to gain a foothold? Because, I mean, we've heard about it for the last few years, but I'm just wondering when you actually started to see a Northern Gateway pipeline proposal.
It was more serious in 1995. We filed what we would call a preliminary information package and started the engagement with the affected people and tried to build commercial support. And that process was going on. But in the 1997 period, 98, there was a greater focus on pipes going east and south. And so Northern Gateway was effectively shelved there for a couple of years. And then again, it became, crystallized back in 2008.
I think a major criticism that you hear from BC is that relationships haven't been built, that Enbridge hasn't done enough to build relationships within the communities that they want this pipeline to cross. Would you agree or disagree?
No, definitely disagree, and I'll tell you why. Because back then we went out from day one, and if we take the Aboriginal peoples as an example, we have to meet with some 45 of them in terms of what we would call potentially affected, and that's within 80 kilometers of the pipe. And as most people know, pipe's buried, and most people would never know there's a pipe there unless they saw a sign at a road crossing that a pipe was buried below. So there's not a lot of impact, but we had a fairly wide engagement with Aboriginal peoples, and what you do is you would give them funds to make an assessment so they could make their own assessment of the project, and then you'd also provide funds so they could do traditional use studies to find out what the impact of the pipeline has been. And so that's been ongoing since then. But there's been certain opponents of the pipeline that just did not want to have the dialogue. So when people say you haven't, it's because they rejected the invitation to talk about the project. They just said we don't want it, and fundamentally those were generally related to opposition to oil sands. Notwithstanding that people use oil and have the benefits from the economy of it, they oppose oil sands, and they just said no, we don't even want to talk. So it's very hard to have those. And a good example was, we knew that the risk for the marine environment would have been a key issue for not just British Columbians, but all Canadians. Like, could it be done safely? And we invited all the coastal communities to join with us in doing a study of what the risks were from a marine aspect. Some joined with us, but many didn't join in doing that study, because we want to take the argument about were our studies correct, or did they have different science. We want to take that out and say, let's all build from this, because we all want this to understand the same answer. Can it be done safely? And many didn't join us because they didn't want to be perceived as having dialogue with the project. They just wanted to oppose it. Their whole intention wasn't to make it better, it was to oppose it. So that's where a lot of that criticism comes from.
And John, I know the opponents are saying, yeah, even one spill is too much, but doesn't any enterprise or venture carry with it some level of risk?
I think that's the fundamental. I mean, you do need to balance the risk reward, and clearly we would see the benefits to Canada are very, very large and certain. The risk, we've tried to get them to as low as practicable and unlikely. So you do have to balance those, but they're the same way you can't say there never will be a spill, but we can't say there will be a spill either. So, but it is something, I mean, practically you need to get that as low as possible and then respond very quickly and effectively if there ever is a spill.
When will we hear a decision on the pipeline?
The Joint Review Panel, now the Joint Review Panel has been out for almost 3 years now, up and down the right-of-way in the Marine Transportation Corridor, hearing from those who are affected or who have an interest. And it started with had we filed sufficient information, was there any outstanding issues, then it went to hearing their testimony directly, and then we're into the formal hearings. That wraps up by mid-year this year, and such the Joint Review Panel will make a decision by the end of this year, and it'll have conditions on it saying that whatever they recommend will have conditions, and then that recommendation goes to the federal government, and they're scheduled to make a final decision by mid-2014.
Mr. Carutthers, I appreciate you carving out an hour in your busy schedule for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.